Chapter 1. Agnosticism. Agnosticism is generally supposed to imply an acknowledgement of ignorance of supramundane agencies and conditions. It is apparent, however, that the agnosticism of science, as exemplified by those great scientists whose attitude in relation to current religious beliefs necessitated the coinage of a new word to express it, can be best defined as aggressive ignorance. An agnostic, as exemplified by such scientists, is one who presumes to define the limits of human knowledge, and upon those limits to erect a barrier against all further inquiry. I need no better illustration than that afforded by the writings of Mr. Herbert Spencer, who is acknowledged to be the fairest and most unprejudiced of all that great constellation of intellectual stars whose coruscations have, as never before, illuminated the path of scientific progress. Mr. Spencer, in his charitable effort to harmonize science and religion, one undertakes to mark the boundary line between the knowable and the unknowable and to inhibit all effort of either religion or science to look beyond the limits thus defined. The unknowable is the entity which he invites religion and science to unite in worshiping, and his recipe for securing absolute harmony between the worshippers, the soporific agent, so to speak, by means of which each is to be lulled into that somnolent condition in which distinctions are not observable and opinions are relegated to the domain of innocuous desuetude. His recipe for securing harmony consists in a mutual agreement that neither of the high contracting parties shall affirm or deny anything worth mentioning in relation to the hypothetical entity that may be supposed to sustain a provisional existence on the unknowable side of Mr. Spencer's boundary line. The things which he invites the united host of religion and science to ignore are numerous. The most of them are cherished beliefs of the most enlightened men of Christian civilization, but Mr. Spencer disposes of them all with great celerity by a method that is at once unique and effective, simple to the last degree, and easily understood and applied. It consists in the employment of a phrase that Mr. Spencer invented himself, apparently to enable him to establish his first principles by a method as simple as first principles themselves usually are. It is unthinkable, is the polemical dynamite bomb with which he demolishes those refractory propositions which refuse to yield to the clumsy weapons of logic. And it cannot be denied that the potential energy of that phrase is incalculable. The rapidity with which it has gone into general use among a certain class of philosophers and scientists as a labor-saving substitute for logic and argument shows that it supplied a long felt want. To do Mr. Spencer entire justice, it must be admitted that he never employs it except in cases of emergency. But in building up his great unknowable, he felt compelled to employ the paradoxical method of subtraction. That is to say, he subtracted a large and varied assortment of unthinkable attributes from the God of Christian faith in order to increase the magnitude of an unthinkable entity, an inconceivable abstraction, which he dogmatically designates as the unknowable. I employ the word dogmatically with deliberation, for when Mr. Spencer assumes to designate the great first cause as unknowable, he deliberately begs the question, the vital question, at issue between religion and materialistic science. If he had chosen a more modest term, as, for instance, unfathomable, it would have been more befitting the conservatism and caution of true science, and no one would presume to question the implied limitation of finite intelligence. It is, in fact, not only an unwarranted assumption, a petitio principii, violative of the first principles of logical ratiocination, for Mr. Spencer to employ the term unknowable as he employs it. But, as I shall presently show, the assumption is not a legitimate deduction from the fundamental premise of his argument. In the meantime, I wish to further justify my statement regarding the monumental dogmatism of agnosticism, and to show that I am justified in defining it as aggressive ignorance. As I have already intimated, the term unknowable is in itself the very quintessence of dogmatism, for it is in itself a declaration, not alone of ignorance, agnosticism, but of the impossibility of anyone ever knowing anything concerning the great abstraction of which Mr. Spencer thinks he is thinking. The most aggressive part of his dogmatism, however, is manifested when, in a mild and roundabout way, to be sure, he denounces religion as irreligious when it persists in believing some of his unthinkable propositions, and in like manner stigmatizes science as unscientific when it presumes to inquire beyond the boundary which separates what Mr. Spencer knows from that which he does not know. In other words, When religion persists in thinking that which Mr. Spencer thinks is unthinkable, it becomes irreligious, and when science tries to find out something that Mr. Spencer thinks is unknowable, it becomes unscientific. Obviously, under the limitations of his environment, Mr. Spencer could inflict no severer punishment upon the respective recalcitrants. We have, then, the spectacle presented to us of the mildest, the gentlest, and in many respects the greatest, of all the agnostics visiting his severest possible penalties upon those who differ with him in opinion on questions of science and religion. Torquemada could have done no more. Mr. Spencer's statement of the major premise of his argument affords a striking illustration of the axiom that the man who attempts to wage war against truth invariably places in the hands of his enemy the weapons for its defense. His proposition, in its simplest form of expression, is that there is a soul of truth in things erroneous. This axiom he applies to the aggregate of religious beliefs, declaring that this general principle must lead us to anticipate that the diverse forms of religious belief which have existed and still exist have all a basis of some ultimate fact. To suppose, he continues, that these multiform conceptions should be one and all absolutely groundless discredits too profoundly that average human intelligence from which all our individual intelligences are inherited. This most general reason we shall find enforced by other more special ones. To the presumption that a number of diverse beliefs of the same class have some common foundation in fact, must in this case be added a further presumption derived from the omnipresence of the beliefs. Religious ideas of one kind or other are almost universal. Admitting that in many places there are tribes who have no theory of creation, no word for a deity, no propitiatory acts, no idea of another life. Admitting that only when a certain phase of intelligence is reached do the most rudimentary of such theories make their appearance, the implication is practically the same. Grant that among all races who have past a certain stage of intellectual development there are found vague notions concerning the origin and hidden nature of surrounding things, and there arises the inference that such notions are necessary products of progressing intelligence. Their endless variety serves but to strengthen this conclusion, showing as it does a more or less independent genesis, showing how, in different places and times, like conditions have led to similar trains of thought, ending in analogous results. That these countless different, and yet allied, phenomena presented by all religions are accidental or factitious is an untenable supposition. A candid examination of the evidence quite negatives the doctrine maintained by some, that creeds are priestly inventions. Thus the universality of religious ideas, their independent evolution among different primitive races, and their great vitality unite in showing that their source must be deep-seated instead of superficial. Later on, Mr. Spencer alludes to the emotional nature of the religious sentiment as follows, and if the religious sentiment displayed habitually by the majority of mankind, and occasionally aroused even in those seemingly devoid of it, must be classed among human emotions, we cannot rationally ignore it. We are bound to ask its origin and its function. Here is an attribute which, to say the least, has had an enormous influence, which has played a conspicuous part throughout the entire past as far back as history records, and is at present the life of numerous institutions, the stimulus to perpetual controversies, and the prompter to countless daily actions. Any theory of things which takes no account of this attribute must, then, be extremely defective. This statement of Mr. Spencer's fundamental premise is seemingly as fair and candid as the exact language of a great scientist could make it. Here is a statement of a broad fact that every person of intelligence recognizes and must admit. There is a soul of truth in things erroneous, there is truth in everything. What could be fairer? What could be more conciliatory? Nay, what could be rarer than the exhibition of such a broad and catholic spirit by a great scientist when dealing with the religious beliefs of all humanity? It serves to establish mutually pleasant relations between Mr. Spencer and his readers, to say the least. It induces in the latter a state of easy confidence, a condition of passive receptivity, as the hypnotists say, so that they are prone to accept further suggestions without critical examination. Now, let us for a moment examine Mr. Spencer's liberal proposition with reference to the alleged object of his essay. His avowed purpose is to reconcile religion with science. To that end he sets out in search of an ultimate religious truth of the highest possible certainty, a truth which will not only reconcile science with religion, but one in which religions in general are at one with each other. This statement of his purpose, which is substantially in his own language, naturally leads one to believe that Mr. Spencer has undertaken a task in the success of which every human being has the highest possible interest. It is obvious that an ultimate religious truth of the highest possible certainty must also be a scientific truth of equal certainty if true religion and true science are to be reconciled. But the majority of mankind will agree that the basis of such a reconciliation, if it is to be of any possible value to mankind, must be not only an ultimate truth of the highest possible certainty, but also one of the highest possible value to science and of utility to the world at large in the regulation of human conduct. This, however, is far from the kind of reconciliation that is the object of Mr. Spencer's ambition. Now, let us briefly examine this ultimate religious truth of the highest possible certainty, this potent verity that is capable of obliterating the distinctions between fetishism and Christianity. This ultimate scientific truth that is the essence alike of all religions and of all science. We have Mr. Spencer's word for it, that on the religious side it is this: the power which the universe manifests to us is utterly inscrutable. On the scientific side, this is the formula. In its ultimate essence, nothing can be known. Considering first the statement of ultimate scientific verity, it must be admitted that it has the oracular ring of a scientific formula. Moreover, it must be conceded that it is a great fact, and a very inconvenient one, by the way, that there are very many things in this world that, to borrow the formula of Lord Dundreary, no fellow can find out. But that great, ultimate truth was not the original discovery of Mr. Spencer, albeit the pains which he has taken to demonstrate it, and to correlate it with his ultimate religious truth, would lead one to suppose that he regarded himself as the Columbus of ultimate verity and of human limitations. It cannot be denied, however, that he was the original and first discoverer of the fact that the two formulas are equivalent. Nor will anyone seek to rob him of the glory due to one who has been able to found a school of religious philosophy upon that assumption. We may, therefore, concede that, in a limited sense, his scientific formula is a statement of an ultimate scientific truth. But by no stretch of liberality of construction can his so-called ultimate religious truth be classed even as a theological dogma, much less as an undisputed and indisputable religious truth. Like his so-called scientific truth, it is simply Mr. Spencer's oracular way of making a statement relating to the supposed limitations of human intelligence. Moreover, when Mr. Spencer offers, as a basis of universal harmonic relations, the declaration that the power which the universe manifests to us is utterly inscrutable, he is guilty of that most heinous of all logical offenses. Begging the question. For that is the very question at issue between the Christian religion and science, or rather between the Christian religion and such scientists as Herbert Spencer. The very essence of Christian belief in God is that man necessarily sustains a natural relationship to his Creator of a most intimate character, and that, therefore, some knowledge of the great first cause is not only possible, but inevitable. No Christian has ever denied the inscrutability of the power that the universe manifests to us, in the general sense of the term. But that it is utterly inscrutable is a doctrine that strikes at the very root of Christian faith, and is an utter repudiation of the life and doctrines of the great founder of the Christian religion. And yet this is just what Mr. Spencer does when he employs the words utterly inscrutable. His attitude may be summed up in a very few words. He starts out professedly in search of the one great, fundamental, ultimate religious truth that underlies, and is the vital, constituent element of, all religions, from fetishism to Christianity. When he finds it and presents it to an expectant world, it is seen that it is not a religious truth at all, that it is not a tenet of any religion on earth, that it is a proposition that has never been considered, either as a fundamental principle or as a constituent element of any religion whatever, but that, on the contrary, it is a proposition that strikes at the very root of every religion worthy of the name, and finally, that it is a statement that is and must be repudiated as the crassest atheism by every Christian denomination, and acceptance of it by the religious and scientific world as a basis of reconciliation on the terms proposed by Mr. Spencer, would at once arrest all progress in the inductive investigation of the claims of Christianity, and reduce the religious world to a state of hopeless imbecility. For, be it remembered, His prescription enjoins abstention from either affirmation or denial of any doctrine or belief concerning God or his attributes, and this inhibition extends alike to science and religion. His sole religious creed, his recipe for reconciliation, is incarnated, so to speak, in that portentous sentence: "The power that the universe manifests to us is utterly inscrutable." And this is agnosticism. The animus of Mr. Spencer's effort must now be apparent. In searching for a formula of reconciliation, he carefully avoided the statement of any proposition confirmatory of the beliefs of any religious sect or system that ever existed. And in making his selection, he took care to formulate a declaration that is in absolute antagonism to the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. Furthermore, while no religious sect can endorse Mr. Spencer's creed, still less can it be endorsed by science. For if science stands for anything, it is for truth. It is its province to search for causes of phenomena, proximate and remote. There are doubtless many scientists who are delighted to be able to formulate their atheistic views in Mr. Spencer's terms, but there are many others whose quest is of inductive proofs of Holy Writ, who believe that scientific methods of research will yet reveal something of the nature and attributes of the great power which the universe manifests to us. It follows that Mr. Spencer's great scheme for the reconciliation of religion with science has failed, and must forever fail, for the reason that an acceptance of his terms involves the total abandonment of all that either one of them stands for. Science and religion can never be reconciled upon the basis of a negative proposition that is neither religious nor scientific, especially one that is expressly repudiated by both. Now, to put Mr. Spencer's propositions into common language, the meaning of which can be grasped by common people, they may be stated thus. To the religionist he says, "There is just one ultimate religious truth of the highest possible certainty that you must admit before your religion can be reconciled with science, and that is that you do not know anything about religion." To the scientist he says, "There is one ultimate scientific verity that you must admit before your science can be reconciled with religion, and that is that you do not know everything about science." It is now quite obvious why it was that Mr. Spencer's proposed great church of the reconciliation was destined to prove a failure from the start. Neither party could conscientiously subscribe to the creed. Let us now re-examine the fundamental propositions with which Mr. Spencer started out and see if we cannot find a legitimate conclusion. The propositions may be summed up, in Mr. Spencer's words, thus: "In all religions, even the rudest, there lies hidden a fundamental verity, common to all religions, a religious truth, in relation to which all religions are at one with each other," etc. As already pointed out, Mr. Spencer promised to consider this fundamental truth, but carefully avoided doing so. He specifically mentioned one of the most obvious of all the fundamental truths common to all religions, its emotional nature, and distinctly promised to consider its origin and its function, declaring that any theory of things which takes no account of this attribute must, then, be extremely defective. He then dismisses that most important attribute of religion by declaring that, as to its origin, it arose by a process of evolution, and, as to its function, it must be adapted to the requirements of existence, adding, "With confessed reluctance, we are also forced to infer that this feeling is in some way conducive to human welfare." It seems almost incredible that Mr. Spencer should have thus summarily dismissed the consideration of an attribute of religion which, to use his own words, has had an enormous influence, which has played a conspicuous part throughout the entire past as far back as history records, and is at present the life of numerous institutions, the stimulus of perpetual controversies, and the prompter of countless daily actions. And yet this is just what he has done, in order to give prominence to his lame and impotent conclusion which has already been discussed. Now, let us adopt Mr. Spencer's fundamental, or major, premise as our own, and briefly inquire, what is that underlying truth which is common to all religions, from fetishism to Christianity? In doing so, let us employ the inductive process, and consider nothing but the well-recognized facts pertaining to the subject matter, bearing in mind always that we are discussing the mental phenomena of religious experience, and not the limitations of human intelligence. Now, this truth, when found, if it is to possess any evidential value for any purpose whatever, must possess certain well-defined characteristics. Amongst these are, it must correlate all religions that have ever existed on the well-recognized lines of religious experience. This is the general proposition. Then, if it is to possess any evidential value in itself as to its divine origin, or as to its natural adaptation to the requirements of existence, or its capacity to promote human welfare, it must possess certain further characteristics. Namely, 2. It must be an instinctive attribute common to all races of mankind above those of the lowest grade of human intelligence. 3. It must be capable of evolutionary development without change of its essential characteristic. 4. It must, in its every stage of progressive development, be more and more conducive to human welfare. 5. It must, in its highest stage of development, be found to be the concomitant of the highest civilization. 6. It must be an attribute that, without change of its essential characteristic, develops in power, if not in intensity, and becomes more and more exalted in its manifestations with every step in the progress of science. 7. And finally, it must be an attribute the implications of which cannot be disproved by scientific induction, but which, on the contrary, attain a higher and higher degree of probability the more strictly and the more directly the processes of inductive reasoning are applied to them. Now, this attribute which correlates all religions and in which all are at one with each other, consists in the belief, with which each individual is imbued, in a spiritual being mightier than himself, but not indifferent to his thoughts and acts, and upon whom he feels a consciousness of dependence. It is obvious that this applies alike to the fetish worshipper and the Christian, together with all the intermediate grades and varieties of religious belief. The difference between religions consists in the different conceptions of the nature and attributes of the object of worship, the relations that exist between that being and man, and the emotions and practices which flow from the recognition of such relations. Now, let us see if this underlying truth answers to the requirements above mentioned. First, then, it obviously correlates all religions. 2. It must be an instinctive emotion, since it is common to all races of men above a certain grade of intelligence. That there are tribes of savages so low in the scale of being that they have no idea of a deity or of a future life simply goes to prove that religion is an inevitable outgrowth of progressing intelligence. 3. That it is capable of evolutionary development. And 4. That in its every higher stage of manifestation it is more and more conducive to human welfare, is shown by the fact that 5. In its highest stage of development, it is the inseparable accompaniment of the world's highest civilization. 6. The history of the great conflict between science and religion, or more properly between science and ecclesiasticism, demonstrates the progressive character of true religion. There never has been a conflict between science and religion. Science has never waged war upon religion. It has from time to time been forced to disclose the fallacies of various theological dogmas, and a fierce struggle has as often ensued. But whenever theology has been forced to yield, religion has always been the gainer, for every greatly advanced step that has ever been taken by science has by just so much enlarged, exalted, and refined man's conceptions of the deity and his attributes. And no one will deny that, in so far as man's conceptions of the deity and his attributes have been thus exalted, by just so much have the religious emotions of reverence, love, and worship been justified, increased, and exalted. Science, therefore, in the 19th century has, in this sense, continued the work which Jesus began in the 1st century. For one of the greatest services that Jesus performed for religion and for humanity was his express repudiation of the crude, anthropopathic conceptions of God which had been handed down from the early Jewish prophets. In their place, he has given us a conception of God, his attributes, and his relations to man that has served to intensify, purify, exalt, and justify that instinctive emotion which is the basic attribute of all religions. And science has continued the work by revealing truths which serve to confirm the intuitions of the master and justify his conclusions. Not that scientists have deliberately set themselves to do this thing, for they have not. On the contrary, each new scientific discovery has been the signal for a shout in chorus that religion has been destroyed and God has been eliminated from the universe, But when the tumult subsides, it is always found that God still reigns and religion still lives. A man-made dogma may have been shown to be fallacious, but religion is all the stronger for the elimination of an error. Perhaps it is just as well that scientists have chosen to assume a hostile attitude to religion, for its friends can always rest assured that its survival is due to its vitality and not to any lack of aggressive effort on the part of its enemies. On the whole, science has been religion's best friend, and the Church is beginning to realize the fact. No intelligent Christian would now be willing to see any one of the great discoveries of modern science eliminated from the world's stock of knowledge, however determinedly his Church may have resisted the innovation when it was first promulgated. No Roman Catholic would now consent to a return to the Ptolemaic system of astronomy, although his Church fought the Copernican system for more than 200 years. No Protestant would willingly consent to the elimination of the Newtonian theorem from the world's stock of science, although, as Luther had reviled Copernicus, so did his successors denounce Newton because he substituted gravity for providence. No intelligent Christian would now consent to part with his knowledge of geology, notwithstanding the rudeness of his first awakening from the poetic dream of a six-day creation. And so with the law of evolution. There are few Christians among those who have given intelligent attention to the study of the subject, who could be induced to relinquish the lofty conceptions of the nature and attributes of the deity. Growing out of the contemplation of the infinite wisdom and power displayed in the great law of progressive development of organic and spiritual life from the monarch to man. Much less could he be induced to return to his former crude and anthropomorphic conception of God as a being of limited intelligence, who is obliged to supplement his work from time to time in order to develop new ideas or to provide for unexpected emergencies. In a word, the intelligent Christian of today has learned that every step in the progress of science, instead of destroying Christianity or weakening its vital force, serves but to confirm its essential doctrines, and to stimulate to their highest expression those emotions of awe, reverence, and worship which are the common attributes of all religions. 7. It now seems evident that the emotion of religious worship possesses a profound psychological and scientific significance. It is instinctive and universal. It becomes stronger with the increasing intelligence of mankind, keeping pace with the progressive development of the other useful faculties of the human mind. It suffers no diminution of vitality by reason of scientific advancement. It finds its highest expression in the most enlightened nations, where it is the life of every benevolent and charitable enterprise, of every institution for the amelioration of human suffering or for the elevation of mankind. These facts alone constitute prima facie proof that the object of worship is a living reality. If it were any other emotion than that of religious worship, no scientist would hesitate to declare that to be the only tenable conclusion. Scientists would point out the impossibility of a faculty without a function, or of love without an existing object of love capable of reciprocal affection. And they would be logically and scientifically right, for these are psychological axioms. If, therefore, the love of God is not an exception to the rule, that instinctive, omnipresent, universal sentiment which has existed in every unperverted human soul since the dawn of creation is an inductive verification of the fundamental tenet of every religion. If experience of the past is a guide to the future, we are now in possession of the key to a solution of the problem of the reconciliation of science with religion. There are but two possible ways by which this desirable consummation can be reached, and as either one of these methods excludes the other, there is but one. One of these methods is for inductive science to utterly disprove the essential doctrines of religion, and the other is for science to prove the essential truth of those doctrines beyond the possibility of a rational doubt. That is to say, the proof should at least be so conclusive that science can no longer decide against the claims of religion on a priori grounds, so conclusive that the burden of proof will rest upon the opponents of religion, so conclusive that no other hypothesis will account for all the facts. As we have seen, scientists have already tried the first method and failed. Thus far, every induction of modern science has tended to confirm the essential doctrines of the Church. Only the non-essential dogmas of theology have been shaken. It is reasonable to suppose, therefore, that further inductions will still further confirm the essentials. This supposition is strongly reinforced by two considerations. One is that the study of those inductive sciences that directly or indirectly concern religion has thus far been largely in the hands of those who are either opposed or indifferent to the claims of religion. The other is that the friends of religion have thus far given very inadequate attention to the inductive study of religion itself, and much less of those sciences which have been heralded as the ruthless destroyers of religion. The mistake is obvious, For if there is truth in religion, it cannot suffer by being brought into contact with any truth in science. There are not two orders of truth in the universe, one antagonistic to the other. If, therefore, there is truth in science and truth in religion, the more deeply those of science are penetrated, the more obvious will be their harmony with religion. It follows that if there is truth in both, science will yet furnish the data for the inductive study of religion. When that day comes, the reconciliation will be inaugurated, and religion and science will read the same Bible and study the same textbooks of science and join, in a scientific and practical sense, in looking through nature up to nature's God.